I like to think about natural resources as sort of that life support system that's out there. And a portion of natural resources that we often don't think about are the people. We don't think about ourselves. And so in that light, as we relate to natural resources, as we relate to the air, as we relate to water, as we relate to wildlife, as we relate to soil, it also includes, I think, how we relate to one another. And so natural resources really encompasses all of that stuff that surrounds us that we haven't made, that we haven't created, but certainly that we have an impact on. And so the big focus for me as an ornithologist for most of my career has been thinking about how forest management, how natural forces such as storms, for example, hurricanes and things like that, how those things impact birds and how they impact bird habitats. And so in that light, as I've thought about how humans interact with other wildlife, with other natural resources, and you look at us here in North America, in the United States in particular, and how we've thought about natural resources, it's historically been from this utilitarian viewpoint. A utilitarian viewpoint is one that looks at the first priority of use. How are we using things? What's nature's worth? What are the natural resources, and what's their worth to us? So, how much is a tree worth to me to some end, as that tree might become paper or might become lumber? That's one of the traditional thoughts about it. But I think that we've also more recently begun to think about the value of these things ecologically. Some people have been doing that historically for quite a long time. You look at someone like Aldo Leopold, for example, who came along in the first half, essentially, of the 20th century, who evolved this thing called a land ethic that asks, how do we treat the land that nurtures us? How do we care for the land? And so that value that we place on natural resources ought to go beyond economics, that it ought to go into some sort of ethical consideration, that we think about nature, that we think about the natural resources around us as things that we care for and that we steward. So here in North America or in the United States, am I thinking about how folks in other parts of the world are using their resources and how I'm impacting resource use or care in other places? So that means that we have to be inclusive of other ideas and at least listening to other ideas and how people think, where they are, what their life experiences are, because everyone doesn't see a tree the same. An example that I use here in the southeastern United States is I am a Black American, and so my history here in the United States is tied to slavery. I had ancestors who were slaves who may have had very bad experiences with forests and with natural resources. So we think about people who were persecuted or lynched, that is, for example, hung in forests, that forests were places to fear for lots of reasons. And so coming forward, I have to think about this historical context that people live in. So if you have stories, if you've grown up with stories about how the forest is a dangerous place because people were either persecuted there, or maybe it's because there were wild animals there that people were fearful of, or conditions that they wanted to escape from, I have to keep that in mind from a natural resources perspective. So I think that's sort of informatic and kind of understanding how people relate to land, how people relate to nature and natural resources. That's a large part of what environmental ed, as I've come into this place, does. Environmental education has a critical role. And so you heard me talk about conservation and environment, and conservation and being a conservationist and environmentalists. That dichotomy that exists, conservationists have often just seen how we use things, and environmentalists have thought about preserving things maybe. So conserve versus preserve. When you think about conserve, think about use and saving some for later. Preserve often refers to not using, or kind of think about putting the cap on the jar of preserves or jelly so that it keeps for a long time. Okay, so there's that divide there, and I think part of what we do as environmental educators, we're the bridge builders, we're the gap fillers, we're the people who take the information, all that data that I talked about that we gather, and we transfer that to others so that they understand it, but not only so they understand it, but so that it's relevant to them, and so that they can use it in their work or just simply in their lives to have better, more fulfilling lives in some sort of way. The thing about conservation, the thing about nature, is that nature is only a couple of letters removed from nurture for me. And so when I think about nature, I think about being in and amongst places and beings that soothe me, that help me to be a better me. As a scientist, I'm trained headwise to think about collecting data, that I go afield, that I collect the best data that I can collect, and that I assimilate that data, that I publish it, and that it gets out. And that's a head exercise. But then why am I out there in the first place? What motivates me to do the work that I do? And what motivates me to do the work that I do is that I love nature. You know, and that's a word that I think we can't shy away from in this whole deal. That love is something that's implicit in what we do as environmental educators. LOVE, that four-letter word that would seem not to be a part of science, that would seem to have somehow drifted away from who it is that we are. So our head thinks about it, our heart connects to our head and this brain function and giving us passion to do what we do, and it moves us to be in these places. And so sunsets that that make us cry, or bird song that makes us laugh, or the smell of an apple orchard in the fall that gives us memories of being in certain places with certain people, or being in Cypress Blackwater Swamp that is special to us. And so all of those things are incredible. So you have the head that thinks, the heart that feels, and then ultimately, as environmental educators, that moves out to two actions, I think, and that's doing with our hands. And that first doing is embracing all of nature in some way and bringing it close to chest, to heart, so that we are part of it, and then speaking it from that point. That's also the action. So head to heart to hand, and then we speak what we feel and what we think. And that's the critical part of who it is that we are in this whole natural resources connection. We are natural resources. We are natural resources that are connected to every other bit and piece of life on Earth. And as long as we remember that, then I think we'll revere that. And then love comes from all of that. And if we love, then I think other things fall into place a little more easily.